It is my pleasure to introduce Stef de Haan. He is a senior scientist at CIP and a special professor of seed systems and agrobiodiversity at Wageningen University's Biosystematics group. He has 30 years of experience in agricultural research and development, emphasizing in-situ conservation, agroecology, food systems, and human nutrition in mountainous regions and indigenous communities. His research areas include genetic resource conservation, seed networks, and food system transitions. He holds a PhD in biosystematics and a master's degree in agroecology from Wageningen University, and is the author of over 100 scientific articles and books. The title of his talk today is Beyond the Arc: Why Saving Seeds Isn't Enough. Welcome, Stef.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Yanni. I hope you can see my screen, and
I can, yes, thank you.
It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, and to have this opportunity to share some of the experience on integrated conservation and looking beyond the gene banks, beyond the vaults, and working with the communities and the on-farm in situ populations of crops. Most of my examples will be from potato. I work a lot on potato in the Andean region. So you'll notice that I'm a bit biased towards this crop and also towards the Andean experience. But I believe that a lot of what I will share today can also be applicable to other centers of origin for other crops and for other realities. So why saving seeds isn't enough? Maybe we should start first with this element, and what is the status quo at the moment, no? And of course, many of you will think, well, this is kind of logical, no? Why should we integrate crops in out there? Of course, because of the ongoing evolution, we should track evolution and understand evolution. Also, when we put accessions in a gene bank, they are kind of disconnected from the local knowledge and the traditional knowledge, and that may be another reason. But at the same time, there are more important reasons beyond that. One is kind of the rhetoric and kind of the logic in which we have ended up. No, we often mention that genetic erosion is happening. Genetic loss will be inevitable if we don't collect and put things in the gene bank. But at the same time, we have more and more evidence as well of many countries and many crop populations that are still actively being maintained in situ. So just saying that it's all disappearing without seriously measuring what is disappearing and what is happening, and especially not monitoring, like some of the other conservation communities, for example, those working on bees or those working on birds, kind of leads to the inevitability of us being blind of what's really happening on farm and in situ. Also, the notion that modern varieties will inevitably replace land races, and that land races have no role in a modern society, is something that does not actually respond to reality. On the other hand, in the whole relationship after the conventions between gene banks and the in-situ communities, the NGO, civil society, indigenous organization, we've kind of ended up in a deadlock. No? And it's kind of like a stalemate. And if we continue to do business as usual and continue to have an environment in which there is a lack of trust, there will be very little progress and we will have paralysis. So it's especially important to also innovate access and benefit sharing arrangements and have a portfolio of what we can do. So in the end, we need to move to approaches that are disruptive, holistic, and provide positive examples of reconciling the interests of global and local communities through an integrated conservation approach, and also providing innovations for farmer rights arrangements. So I will try to get into the how during this presentation based on examples from the International Potato Center and our work in the Andes, which can be expanded and replicated in other environments. When I talk about integrated conservation, and I will get back to this several times during this presentation, I mean the collaboration and the interactions between crop genetic resources in their natural environment, managed by smallholder or indigenous farmers, and the gene banks, especially the gene banks that are located in centers of origin, have a particular role to play in making this conservation integrated. And when we talk about integrated conservation, I see there are at least four angles. One is the backup, the mutual backup angle, the need to monitor and take the pulse of the on-farm conservation and how populations are evolving in the field compared to what we conserve in gene banks, how knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge can complement more formal knowledge and scientific knowledge, and how we can have reciprocal relationships through payment for ecosystem services arrangements, biodiversity credits, and benefit sharing arrangements between communities and the gene banks. Ideally, this is done at multi-scale level. So all the way from microbiomes, genes, all the way to the hotspot level. And you could conceptualize gene banks having several satellites out there, which are unique hotspots or unique populations with which the gene banks interact very regularly to build these examples of integrated conservation. On the one hand, we have to measure to understand and the situation. That's when we talk about observatories and take the pulse, kind of to say, of the patient and know how the populations are changing, whether loss is happening, whether enrichment is happening. When there is evidence of loss, we may think of restoration. And of course, also act when there is a demand from the populations, in this case, the farmer populations with whom we work for repatriation, benefit sharing schemes, education, or other types of innovation. Let's first have a few steps back and especially look for the case of potato, kind of how this integrated approach evolved. And one of the roots of that is that when we observe diversity today in the field, and here I have two examples from two particular cultivar groups, the Wairo cultivar group, which is a very popular landrace, which can even be found in the supermarket in Lima, and also the Pumamakin cultivar group. These were already put in pottery, in moche pottery, about 900, 1000 years ago. And each of these pots we can find in a museum, while the potatoes are still alive and kicking, and we can find them in the fields of the farmers. So after the demographic collapse, when the Spaniards arrived in South America, the population declined from 15 million to 1 million. So compared to a climate shock or compared to a socio-economic shock, that was one of the most disruptive events probably in the history of the Andean region. Despite that, we still defined the same land races in the field. So this clearly indicates that there is some level of attachment, cultural attachment, but also a high level of resilience in the populations. When the International Potato Center was founded in 1971, already a few years later, in 73 and 75, some of the famous potato researchers already rung the bell to warn that possibly genetic erosion and loss would be happening at that time, specifically attributed to diseases, but also the first generation of improved varieties and modern varieties that were being released. At that time, the idea that eventually in a few years everything would be wiped out was prevalent, and of course that fueled the need for collections. But then a decade later, when we got at the International Potato Center the first generation of anthropologists working with the gene bank curators, A lot of this notion of genetic erosion was already being questioned and refined. No, that actually a lot of the farmers worked at the same time with modern varieties and land races. That some land races may have disappeared, but actually there was still an active management of these land races in a lot of the farmer fields. And that is when the first efforts to better understand the ecology and the socio-ecological dimensions of the conservation started to be researched at the International Potato Center. Through time, from the early 1970s till now, how in situ and on-farm conservation and the relationship with the gene bank is being established has slowly built up from a set of individual activities, community seed banks, the experience with the potato park in southern Peru, to a set of more integrated and holistic approaches that do not only promote interventions, but at the same time also try to take the pulse of the conservation and try to have new approaches to provide value, but also provide incentives for the custodian farmers. So at the same time, this region, of course, one of the centers of origin of multiple crops, the Peruvian region, is not only a center of diversity of crops and genetic diversity, but it's also, you could say, a laboratory of many different approaches to conservation outside of the gene banks, all the way from anthropologists working on cultural reaffirmation. There are agrobiodiversity zones, which are currently more than 11 that are being promoted by the Ministry of Agriculture. There is the chef movement that has some of the top chefs in the world that are really putting diversity and conservation on the map, and all kinds of different interventions. And of course, when we work in our gene banks and we work with breeding programs, we regularly get demand from our donors to do an impact assessment of how our interventions are actually progressing. And that's still an area where we have very little knowledge when it comes to in situ conservation interventions. What is actually the impact of all these conceptually different interventions and approaches? But in the end, even though in situ and ex situ conservation should ideally be complementary and work together in an integrated approach, essentially they are different. No? And here I just point out a few of the key differences between ex situ and in situ conservation. The realm in which they happen often in centers of origin, whether it's rice in Laos, or whether it's teff in Ethiopia, or millets in India, or whether it's potato in the Andes, they essentially are managed by farmers. Often they are part of an informal system, which is quite robust and farmer managed. And also, when we talk about on-farm conservation, we generally don't talk about population or about accessions. We much rather prefer to deal with populations, populations of land races that are dynamic rather than static. So it's also important to notice that for on-farm in situ, the end objective is not conservation per se, but it's rather the adaptive capacity and the resilience and the value of land races for the farmers to have robust livelihoods. And also, just like when we talk about ex situ conservation, which can be done in the cold store, it can be done through cryopreservation in vitro. The same is true for in situ conservation. There's not just one type of in situ conservation. On the one hand, it's a historical phenomenon that has been done autonomously by many farmer communities without any of the interventions that we know today, community seed banks or other type of intervention. At the same time, the development community has this whole portfolio of interventions, and as scientists, or maybe also as gene bank curators, we try to understand if there are any gaps, if there are any unique materials being threatened or emerging, and trying to have also a sense of the ecosystem services, including nutrition security or climate adaptation potential that is provided through the on-farm managed land traces. But when we talk about in situ conservation, essentially, we can talk about interventions. We can also talk about its own independent realm, as it is done by smallholder farmers. Essentially, it's not only about the crops, it's not only about the genetic resource, but it's also about the whole indigenous knowledge system that is attached to land races, whether it's the ethnotaxonomy, the use in the traditional cuisine, how knowledge is transferred from mother to daughter or from father to son. That whole element cannot be conserved ex situ and is essentially only happening and dynamically happening in an in situ or on-farm environment. So when we get back to the integrated conservation approach, how do each of these four pillars potentially work in practice? And I say potentially because what I'm about to present are just ideas and examples of how we have tried to deal with it in the International Potato Center. But I'm not promoting a blueprint, nor am I suggesting that this is the only way to do it. I believe there are many different innovations occurring around the world. And the only argument that I really want to make is, I think, as gene banks and gene bank curators, we need to learn from this and have a community of practice to kind of take the best practices and see how we can replicate those best practices. So let's first go to monitoring. Especially for potato, over the last decade, we've made a lot of advances to monitor landrace populations. When we look at the Andean region, on the left hand, you can see different levels of ploidy and how they are geographically distributed. And in the graph on the right, how conceptually we can approach monitoring, no? All the way from monitoring genes, all the way to monitoring the spatial distribution at the community level in different hotspots or microcenters. And ideally, it would take different points in time once we have a baseline to understand how populations of land races are shifting over time. Now, to do this, in the case of potato land races, we're talking at least 4,500 different land races. We have to choose our battles. No, we cannot do monitoring everywhere. Although in a moment I'll make the argument that now with citizen science and mobile applications, we can probably do this if we have the right incentives. But initially, to do good baselines, we have to choose our battles. And so in 2013, we started with an initial expert elicitation with curators, but also crop diversity experts of the potato to define which are the most complementary hotspots in the Andes to actually do this baseline establishment and to start doing the monitoring. That was in 2013, and then 10 years later, we developed a methodology that not only uses expert elicitation, but also uses eco-geographical, social, and land race distribution data, including from gene banks, to have a better establishment of complementary hotspots. The idea is to select those hotspots that have most of the unique land races and that are representative of the gene pool, and where we can go back over time to take the pulse of the conservation status. So this article was published in 2013, explaining the methodology. It all started based on the distribution of cultivated potato in the Andes, which we can see on the left for the case of Peru. Everything which is in green are flowery land races. Everything in red are more towards the south, towards the Lake Titicaca, are bitter land races, and in black are the distribution of improved land races. And of course, we were particularly interested in the land races, not so much in the improved varieties. Then we did different spatial overlaps with the data that we had available. So on the one hand, land race richness, also cultivated area of the species of land races, the distribution of the species, the proximity to gene pool 1, gene pool 2, crop wild relatives that are crossable, the distribution of different indigenous language groups, but also the eco-geography, the complexity of the geography within the grids. That led us in this map to where we see the orange and the red dots to areas that have particularly high diversity. Then as a next step, we needed to do the complementary network analysis to make sure that within each of the potential hotspots, there is the highest level of unique land races that are not repeated in other hotspots. So when we did that exercise, we ended up with close to 20 possible areas for monitoring. And then in the map number C, we still did the expert elicitation with people working in those sites to also have expert opinion. And then ended up with a final list of 13 hotspots that are highly complementary for in situ systematic monitoring. Then if we do monitoring, just like those communities that work on birds every year with the Global Big Day, or those countries that every year have a national bee count, one of the most important parts is that you have at least a semi-structured tools that you can replicate in time and across sites. So at the moment we have a toolbox. It's called Ricui Agrobio. It's also available on the web. It's for the moment only available in Spanish because of the community of practice that we have in the Andean region that covers Chile all the way to Colombia. We initially started with 9 different tools, which include genotyping, participatory GIS, quantitative red listing, also qualitative red listing, plant photography, cataloging, rapid assessment methodologies based on survey, but also some recent publications like a practical threat assessment that was published together with the University of Birmingham, and the 11th protocol, which is based on citizen science and the use of a mobile application, which is called VAR Scout. I'll get back to VAR Scout in a moment. So when we apply those tools, what we can do is make sure that all of those different levels, all the way from the genetic level to the landscape level, are reflected in a baseline repository or a baseline catalog. And so here I wanted to show one example of such a catalog that includes then the richness of the land races in a particular hotspot, but also indicators of their their evenness and their relative abundance, and sometimes also nutritional composition or other types of data. So this is one of the catalogs for one of the hotspots. It's the districts of Yauli in Pucará in the area of Huancavelica. This publication can also be downloaded on CG Space. And then as a book, it contains a description of each of the land races with plant photography, but also with a genetic fingerprint, nutritional analysis, and also other indicators, including local ethnobotanical information. All of these publications are published and put in the public domain with the prior informed consent of the local communities. And generally, also the local communities are the first one to receive these repositories for their own use, whether it's at school or as used by the indigenous authorities. It includes also red listings. Of course, ideally these red listings, because they are so temporally dependent, whether it's a good year or a bad year. In this case, it's only one point in time. based on quantitative sampling of about 300 random households. So how many families have these land races? And when we take a random sample in the seed store, how often do these land races occur? And that's how these indicators are calculated. And then also through participatory GIS, for each of the land races, we can determine their geographical distribution in the landscape. So whether in terms, for example, of altitudinal range distribution, they have a very tight altitudinal belt or a more ample altitudinal belt. At the same time that this helps to determine the spatial distribution of the land races, it also helps to make timeline comparisons. A lot of the accessions in the gene bank at SIP, they were also recorded with altitude data. So this allowed us to compare certain region. In this case, we compare the Pasco region and the Huancavelica region, and we're able to establish that in the last almost half a century, both bitter and non-bitter land races moved upwards because of temperature increase, likely, and also the upward expansion of pests and diseases, on average around 280 meters. So there is a growing number of landrace catalogs, and for each of the hotspots, and also increasing amount of civil society organizations and regional governments that are starting to do these catalogs. And that's of course fantastic, because each catalog in situ helps us to have a better understanding of the biogeography of the landrace populations. And this is just an example of a new catalog that will come out later in this year from the Titicaca region together with Aymara farmers in Bolivia. And we have another one coming out probably in 2026, 2027 for the Cusco region, specifically for Paucartambo. And in this Paucartambo region also and that's another opportunity that some gene banks, for example, the CIMIT gene bank in Mexico, with Denise Costis and her colleagues, they went back to some of the locations where collections were done half a century ago or a few decades ago. We are doing a similar assessment for the area where we have the highest density of landrace collections in the Andes. This is the Paucartambo area, where we have good data all the way going back to 1910. And of course, between this period of 1910 and 1940s, a lot of the international collection missions, including from the Vavilov team, but also from the team of Jack Hawks, made collections in that area. This is still a study that is going on, but of course, when we do monitoring, we don't always need to start from scrap with the baseline. If there is good baseline data that allows us to go back, we should take that opportunity as well. Then also for monitoring, I think if we look at the conservation community, of course, iNaturalist, eBird, and how others that are interested in biodiversity are monitoring nowadays biodiversity, we see that a lot of this monitoring is happening real time. And probably the most advanced is the group of bird watchers. No? So about 5 years ago, we started to think, why can't we do this also with crop varieties? No, I have a group, a community of potato watchers or agrobiodiversity watchers, and provide incentives to have a much more real-time impression of the conservation status of land races. Because every time when we finish a catalog, basically it takes us 3 to 4 years. And by that time, the situation in the field may already have changed again. So VARScout was developed a few years ago together with a community of programmers and different organizations. This is a freeware that can be downloaded on your mobile phone. There are several steps that you have to take, but basically it is quite easy. Once you have it installed, you register, you take a picture. The picture goes together with your waypoint and your geographical location, including altitude. and you write down the name of the landrace and upload it to a database. So, but who could be the persons observing potato landraces? No, and so initially we started to work with youth and with schools. And so in 2022, we had the first regional school contest in a region called Cerro de Pasco, which is in central Peru. And nowadays, just a bit more than a week ago, for the International Day of Potato, we launched the second national citizen science contest to monitor potato land races all over Peru. And this is organized together with Concitec, which is the Peruvian Science Council, FAO, but also the Agricultural Fund for International Development, FIDA, is involved. And most importantly, of course, the schools and the Ministry of Education. So here, the kids that either observe and register the diversity from their parents, their neighbors in their communities, they can win a trip to one of the events from the Peruvian Science Council. And they can also win notebooks or laptops or other types of incentives when they participate in this national contest. All of this information is then put on a platform. It's called Wikipotato or Wikipapa. And every time an upload is made with the VARScout app, the observations appear on this website. And hopefully in the future, when we move to really a large level participation, we can really talk about big data, use image recognition, and also artificial intelligence to analyze the nomenclature of especially of cultivar groups and varieties to have a better idea of the conservation status. This started with schools, but now we're expanding also to seed fairs and to universities throughout the Andean region. And this year also this contest will be held in Chile, on the Chiloé Islands, and also in Bolivia around the Lake Titicaca region. So observations are put in this platform, which is called Wikipotato platform, and this is still at the pilot level, and hopefully every year we get higher levels of participation. But in 2024, in the national contest in Peru, we had a total of 438 participants, mostly youth and young people, 21 different regions, registering potato land races from more than 948 families, resulting in the registration of a bit over 1,400 unique images and land race names. And beyond the value of monitoring, it also has a value for intergenerational dialogue. This is just one example from the school contest in Cerro de Pasco, where the student used also the opportunity for learning from her mother and her grandmother. And this was one of the statements that she made after completing the contest. So this is the monitoring pillar. Let's move to the reciprocity pillar. And I realize that time is not on my side. We're already almost 35 minutes in, but let's move to reciprocity. This part has very much linked to farmers' rights and to benefit sharing. And one of the models that since 11 years we try to promote in the Andean region is a direct relationship between those companies that have an interest in sharing benefits directly with custodian farmers by strengthening custodian farmer organizations. And why custodian farmers and custodian farmer organizations? Because these are very special types of farmers. They're not a few, there are hundreds of these types of farmers throughout the Andean region, but they have a special passion for maintaining and preserving large collections of land races. And so often these farmers live in very isolated areas. They are not organized like a typical coffee cooperative or a cacao cooperative. So getting them organized for them themselves to express what benefit sharing means for them was a first step. And this first step, of course, started from the international recognition of the importance of all these services that are provided by smallholder farmer communities and their right to participate in benefit sharing, but then also the right for them to express themselves what benefit sharing means for them, no, and to make decisions. And in order to make decisions, people have to be organized and people have to get around the table and discuss. No? And so that's often what is lacking when we talk about custodian farmers, the level of representativeness that they have as individuals versus as an organization. So in 2013, the first company, one of the larger Dutch potato companies, committed to starting this pilot with 50 households. At the time, those households were selected by an anthropologist who did an extensive stay of 3 months throughout central Peru to identify custodian farmers that were already working with NGOs or with regional governments. That was in 2014, 11 years ago, when Aguapan, the Association of Potato Guardians, was established. Each of the members of this association receives a monetary bonus every year that comes directly from the company. There is no overhead cost. The group decides themselves how they invest it, whether it's in agricultural inputs, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education. There is an independent support group that helps especially the farmer leaders in everything which is representativeness, legal issues, and also they're organizing their annual meeting. And over the last 10 years, this model has grown. Currently, there are two permanent companies that are permanently supporting this initiative. And the most important element maybe is the farmer leadership. So, of course, in the beginning, this leadership was quite questionable because people didn't know each other, come from completely different isolated communities from different parts of the Andes. But now, for the last 10 years, they have met every 3 months. They all have an annual meeting every year with all the guardians. And it has really become a movement with quite a bit of influence also in Peru. Earlier in the year, they were invited by the Peruvian Congress to discuss the indigenous seed law. And maybe beyond the benefit sharing scheme and resources flowing directly to these families, maybe this is the most important achievement, is the self-representativeness and the pride of the farmers that they bring to the table when they interact with possible investors and also with decision makers. Another important milestone was in 2024 when the first female president was elected, Aurea Mendoza, who's currently the farmer leader of the Agropan group. Again, this year the group will meet in 2025 in the city of Huaraz, and they currently integrate a bit more than 100 households, and also a third company will accompany this initiative this year. This is kind of a timeline of how this experience developed. The argument that I want to make, if this works for potato, which is a food crop that is not exported, there is no interest that also from the companies to access the genetic materials. It's basically benefit sharing without access. But if this works for a food crop, which is not an export crop, this model should also work for other crops like cacao or quinoa that are export crops and also have a very active private sector participation. So I think this model is highly replicable. And some of the main impacts is especially the documentation of what these farmers conserve, but also the direct monetary benefit sharing and how it is used for health education and farm inputs. And of course, also the prestige and the proudness, the awareness and the connectedness of the custodian farmers has made a huge difference. So this has led in Peru to the farmers being able to talk directly to local authorities, being able to negotiate themselves their conditions. And also last year, at the launch of the first International Day of Potato, two representatives, one youth representative and one elder, were invited to Rome by the World Food Organization, by FAO, to be present at the ceremony of the International Day of Potato. Especially youth and youth engagement is important, and many of the young farmers that are members of Agropan, they are also interested in how can diversity generate income. So one of the innovations that started from the farmers themselves is to link varietal mixtures, which is the way how the farmers eat the varieties to the market. So they created this brand. It's a collective brand. It's called Miski Papa, which means basically delicious potato. It is really marketed as something that is healthy, like cooked potatoes, different land races with different nutritional compositions, including vitamin C, but also antioxidants. And every time the mix contains a surprise, and it is directly traceable to one of the custodian farmers that is selling this at a premium price. Uh, this is kind of an example of how also markets can potentially contribute to conservation. When we get to backup, of course, this element is very important also for the gene banks, and of course the backup means that when we do a gap analysis, that we can, if there is trust access, uncovered land races or crop wild relatives that we can incorporate into the gene bank. But at the same time, also the possible demand from farmers when there is an extreme weather event or when there is the need for restoration. And of course, with climate change, this becomes increasingly relevant. Here we see a community that's affected by an out-of-season frost. And a frost in February in the middle of the growing season means a lot of loss of seed and potentially a lot of loss of genetic resources. Of course, the different land races and the different varieties have different levels of resistance. And that is some type of a coping mechanism to not put all your eggs in one basket, a very well and long-term established strategy that farmers use. But of course, there's also the need to recover seed after such an event. No, and when we did a few years back a study on how farmers recover seed after an extreme event, we found that often these networks are quite short. And if it's not a regional extreme event, but a localized extreme event like hail or frost, a lot of the seed is recovered to quite short connections and also within a quite modest distance from where the farmers live. But in a good year, while farmers provision much more seed, of course, that goes down in a bad year, and the amount of seed being acquired increases in volume. And in this particular study, we found that truck drivers and farmer markets play an important role in recovering a lot of this diversity. Also, we found in this study that actually the amount of exchange and the connectivity of the network depends a lot on the type of cultivar group. So some of the non-commercial land races, and especially the bitter land races, there are much fewer connections through which the farmers are able to recover this diversity. So, and that's where elements on a particular role like repatriation or rematriation programs can have a very powerful impact. And of course, this is also a long-term commitment of the gene bank, of the CIP gene bank. So repatriation linked to seed security is one of the ways that a backup can be provided from ex situ to in situ. At the same time, the gene bank communities over the last decades, we have invested a lot in genetic gap analysis, often based on distribution and collection data. But also when we move to the field, so this is an example of a map of 2 different provinces in Peru with 14 different custodian farmers who provided samples of all their land traces for genetic fingerprinting to the International Potato Center. When we did this genetic fingerprinting and we compared it to what we had in the gene bank, we found that in one of the provinces in Pasco, there were 41 unique land traces that were not yet present in the gene bank, and 14.7 unique accessions in the case of the Sierra de Lima, which is basically the closest province to the capital city of Lima, where we actually didn't expect to find so much unique diversity, but that maybe tells something about how much there is still out there in other regions that are more remote. But because of the level of confidence through the AguaPan model that we had constructed with these communities, we also got the authorization from the farmers and the local indigenous authorities to include these accessions into the CIP gene bank. So basically the backup function is mutual, no, and has both value for the farmers and value for the gene bank. And this integrated approach, what it leads to, especially when you work structurally with communities over a long period of time, is trust. And trust is really the basis to have these mutual backups between the in situ and the ex situ collections. Last, I want to mention briefly something about complementary knowledge, because between indigenous and local knowledge and knowledge out there in the society, and also knowledge that we can generate from the gene bank and from the germplasm screening and through science, there is a lot of potential to complement through integrated conservation. And so one of these is, of course, through cuisine and through food systems. This is an example of a book that we published a few years ago together with some of the chefs from all the way from Argentina up to Colombia, but also farmers who are famous for their farmer cuisine, of how the chef movement and the farmer cuisine can link up to revalue agrobiodiversity. And this leads then to the publication of and visualization of these kinds of knowledge, like local knowledge about food preparation versus more advanced or modern knowledge about, through ways how chefs prepare the food. And some particular groups like this Solanum pureja, which is generally except for in Colombia, but in other countries, one of the species that is becoming scarcer, provides then also opportunities of how to revalue these types of species and the land races that we can still access for cuisine. The importance there is also because for farmers, like we discussed earlier, often the conservation is not an objective in itself. And a lot of the reasons why farmers continue to grow land races and mixtures of land races relates to the cuisine, and especially the culinary traits which are considered superior. So this also relates to food processing. So here the white that you can see on the background, this is called sarta de tunta, which is a typical potato dish from the Altiplano region around the Lake Titicaca, and uses a traditional food processing technology which is called freeze drying or chuñificación. So this is how it looks once the potato is freeze dried, and then after that it can be used for the recipes. But the recipes can be complemented also by more formal research to explore the nutritional composition of these land races when they are processed either in this tunta or moraya, which is the white on the photo on the right, or the black chuño, which is in the bottom on the photograph. At the same time, education. So in Peru, there is, throughout the Andes, there is a lot of what is called bilingual intercultural education, where there is a free portfolio for curriculum development and developing curriculum together with the teachers and the Ministry of Education to revalue very early on the local knowledge related to land races can be very impactful. So this is an example of a manual that was done together with the local Directorate of Education in Cusco, developed by the teachers about how to revalue and take genetic diversity into account into local education initiatives. Very last and potentially impactful, already 2 years having a link to the Aguapan model is public procurement for food for social protection programs, but also prisons, public institutions, hospitals. There's a lot of resources going through these public procurement programs. In Brazil, there has already been a strong connection between family farming and the procurement of diverse foods. And in Peru, there have been now a few pilots of buying quinoa, buying native potatoes, and potentially also a strong role with potential complementary knowledge about how diversity can be used in school nutrition. This is my very last slide, and maybe some key messages. A lot is happening, I think, and during the last 10 years, a lot of progress has been made between the connection between gene banks and on-farm in-situ conservation movements. And one of the positive elements is maybe that this has become more structural and become a bit more mainstream. But at the same time, there is still a lot that needs to be done. And compared to the conservation communities that work with birds or with other types of fauna, I think the crop conservation community is way behind. And there is still a lot of opportunity for us to catch up in speed. So the old paradigm that eventually everything will be lost and we have to collect it to only put it in the gene bank is not enough. We need to also have monitoring satellites depending on the crop or the farmer community that we relate to as a gene bank for monitoring. Also, especially for gene banks in national gene banks, but international gene banks in centers of origin, we cannot be passive about the need to experiment with benefit sharing schemes and farmers' rights. So there's a lot of opportunity there to build innovative approaches to farmers' rights and benefit sharing, whether it's agrobiodiversity credits or whether it's experimental auctions. There's all types of possibilities possible. And of course, the backup and the complementary knowledge, I think, is at the very core of where gene banks can really make a difference by connecting with the communities. So as a future vision and to end these talks, I hope that this will not happen probably in a year, but hopefully in a decade, that we can have a network of networks for integrated conservation across different centers of origin with communities of practice exchanging best practices for this integrated conservation involving in situ communities, CG centers and national gene bank systems. And I really hope we will get there in the future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these few experiences with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stef. Yeah, wonderful and very dense. I found it particularly interesting how you identified the 13 hotspots and the monitoring tools and also the apps. I had no idea there was so much innovation going on. So this is a wonderful, I think, eye-opener for many of us who work with gene banks. that so much is going on in your area. So we have a lot of questions, and I'd just like to read those to you. So the first one is, we are a plant genetic resources for food and agricultural community, have been talking about complementary conservation since the early days. How is what you have described conceptually different? So what you have described, is it conceptually different from what, for example, a community is doing, and they have been doing complementary conservation? So perhaps you can point out how this is a little bit different from traditional ways in which complementary conservation has been done elsewhere.
Yes. Yeah, of course, I don't know exactly the details of how your community has done the complementary conservation. And that's also why I mentioned in the beginning, this is not a blueprint. I think there are many valuable experiences. Maybe the main difference that I'm arguing for is that just like we have best practices for gene banks and for ex situ conservation, we should also move to a portfolio
Mm.
of best practices for integrated conservation. And as long as these complementary conservation methodologies and experiences are hidden, it is very difficult to apply them across different gene pools, across different sites and in time. And of course, like we all know, to be able to tell anything intelligent about the conservation status of land races, we need to have like semi-standardized protocols, and we also need to be consistent in taking the pulse over time, and that's maybe something that we try to promote. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity for learning across these different communities, and I'd be very curious to also learn what your community is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and Steph has provided his email in case you do want to reach out to him on the last slide, so feel free to do that. Our next question is, you talked about monitoring diversity, which is great. Is there also a need for predicting where changes might be about to occur? For example, with climate change, could you also, as part of that work, be predicting if something is, for example, more vulnerable to drought, or there are things happening? The question is there also a need for predicting where changes might be about to occur?
Yeah, and I think the answer is quite simple. Definite yes. No, I think all tools that help with forecasting and predicting uh, are also of a lot of use. So uh, a lot of the foresight and kind of adaptation potential, or that will help guide, I think, also the decision making. And I think it's not one or the other. I think ideally they would go hand in hand. So definite yes, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, these couple of questions I'm going to combine into one comes from Carolina Roa. Hello, Carolina, and good to have you on board. She congratulates wonderful work. She says, are the catalogs and the VAR Scout app available in indigenous languages such as Aymara, Quechua? And if not, are there plans to have them in the future?
Okay, now that's a fantastic question. And so some of the catalogs, especially the earlier catalogs, the first catalog actually that I think Carolina might have seen from 2006, 2007, has a section in Quechua. And also some of the recent catalogs, including a recent catalog that was done by the potato park itself, by the farmers from the potato park. It's all in Quechua, so it doesn't even contain Spanish. It's not a SIP contribution. It's done by the farmers themselves in the potato park. But there are several examples of that. The main challenge with the indigenous languages is that they are mostly oral languages. No, so a lot of the farmers who speak Quechua or Aymara, they have difficulty also reading Quechua or Aymara because it was originally not a written language. And and just like potato taxonomists, the linguists tend to fight a lot about how you should write it, and that creates sometimes conflict as well between the linguists and between the local population. Uh, uh, so it would be nice to have it in the local language, but I think we also have to be careful whether people would actually be able to understand it better, especially if it's written. Maybe if it goes together with audio visual and spoken,
Yeah.
then that would add a lot of value. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. This question, I'm going to try and interpret it.
Mm.
Thank you, Steph. It says, what is the difference? You have a table where you state what in situ and ex situ differences are, and you have a number of things regarding breeding and so forth. The question is, why breeding in situ is considered to be an informal one, given that there's already laws and regulations and intellectual property rights for for the in situ part of your table. Why is it considered informal? And
Yes.
there are a major evolution came from the breeding in ex situ and also from in situ. So why give it that term of informal is what I'm
Yeah. But,
trying to
yeah.
harvest from this
Okay.
question is informal is kind of a way of saying something is lesser than something more formal and
Yeah.
structured.
No.
So the question is, why do we give this an informal categorization when it actually was very formal with proper breeding and proper regulations and proper intellectual property rights?
Yes, oh, that's a fascinating
Yeah.
question, and also the $1 million question, which we can philosophize a lot about. But I agree that the word informal can have a negative connotation, and it's often used in the literature. And maybe another word is better, like using, for example, I think in the seed system world, people prefer to say farmer seed systems rather than informal seed systems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is this beauty to informality. So everybody wants to formalize everything, and the art of in situ conservation to a large extent is also a way to resist. It is in part also a resistance movement, and that goes all the way back to the times of the colonization, using food and seeds as a form of resistance. And this resistance, to a large extent, was informally organized, and it's still informally organized today. And for me, that's a beautiful part of the informality, that it doesn't really matter whether it's the informal food system, how things are being traded and exchanged, or
Mm.
whether it's the informal seed system. They are actually very functional and very logic and very robust systems. And so, as soon as you try to formalize something, there is also the risk that you actually take out yeah, the strength of the system. And a good example of that is what's currently happening in Peru. So the Aguapan movement and a lot of the civil society, they are talking with the Congress because they want this a law on recognizing farmer seed. And then in the law, there are several clauses that obligate the farmers to register and document things.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
so, so you can only be, something can only be recognized as soon as it's registered in a variety register. And so all the land races should be registered in like a national register. Is that what we really want? And do we think that is helpful to take things out of the informal system that actually works well as it is? I think it's more also about recognizing that there is a beauty to the informality. And a few anthropologists have written some fascinating stuff about this, also about indigenous people and seeds. For example, the art of not being governed. There is also there is a beauty to that as well. So I think we shouldn't worry too much when things are under the radar screen. I think that's actually the beauty. And in that sense, I do not think we need to link informal to being something negative. It is
Yeah.
actually something positive. Yeah.
Yeah. Or perhaps informal is equivalent to being flexible. So,
Yes.
it's the beauty of it is the flexibility of it, that it can recover from a disaster as much as it can recover from loss of biodiversity. So I think so you've already partially answered the next one. How does the Peruvian government accommodate benefit sharing directly received by the indigenous farmers? Does the government intervene with benefit sharing received by the by the farmers directly, or are these two separate things?
They are two separate things. They are two separate things because currently there is no kind of uh, benefit sharing scheme with the exception of RESCA, which is kind of like these auctions that have been implemented by the Ministry of Environment, not by the Ministry of Agriculture, especially to promote farmers to keep crops that were at the or land races that were close to extinction. But in the case of the Aguapan example, it's a direct relationship between the farmers and the companies. And so there is no government intervention, with the exception that the government is also part of the support group. So basically providing advice. Uh, and so, but conceptually, I think, especially for the people who have been involved in the negotiations of the Article 9 of the International Treaty, sometimes there's a bit of this tension, no? Because uh, like when companies pay directly to farmers, of course they also have a relationship of power, and that could potentially be used negatively, and that needs to be managed very carefully. And of course, the logic of having a common pool fund where companies put funds anonymously is that it is kind of more neutral.
Right.
But there is also a second side to this argument, which is that for example, for a cacao company or for a quinoa company or for a potato company to tell a positive story about the crop that they are working with has a lot of power for the company as well. So for companies, it can be very powerful to tell a story about biodiversity conservation if it directly relates to their support group or directly relates to their crop.
Yeah, thank you. Our
Mhm.
next question, thank you very much. And this question is about integrated conservation. This person would like to know, what is the biggest challenge that you have faced? And do you think that such approach that you took could be applied to cereal crops or to crop relatives?
Yes, I think the most significant challenge is continuity. Like the especially when we work with benchmark sites or observatories, which are basically locations where we monitor over time. And also for the benefit sharing, I think the continuity and the long-term commitment that goes well beyond projects, and so needs buy-in from the local actors, but also from the gene bank that does the integrated conservation approach. That's the main challenge. So not thinking in terms of a 3-year project, but keep this running for decades, no, and for the future to come. Uh, that is the main challenge, and I think this approach can be applied for any cultivated landrace pool, also for legumes and grains or fruits and vegetables. And I think for crop wild relatives, the approach would probably have to be quite different because of the yeah, their humans are not so key as for land races in keeping it alive, no? So the approach would be different, but I think also their population monitoring, citizen science,
Mhm.
having key hotspots where you go back with a regular interval. Some of those principles could be exactly the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
This also has to do about intellectual property rights and in particular geographical indications. So this person would like to know if any Andean countries or any potatoes in Peru have any intellectual property rights or geographical indicators, particularly as a result of this work.
No, not yet, and not as a result of this work. There are a few groups working in Peru, which are more civil society organizations that are working on geographical indication for land races together with the Ministry of Agriculture. And I think the data from this type of efforts, the monitoring efforts and the citizen science can help to support a claim for geographical indication. But as a result of the work, no claims have been made. And but we know that some of the land races are quite endemic to certain regions. And so I also believe that there is a potential for those regions to make a claim about geographical indication or a denomination of origin. And I know also on the Chiloé Islands in Chile, the Universidad Austral de Chile, they are exploring this option for potatoes from the Chiloé Islands, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. This is regarding the VAR Scout app. And it has to do with the verifications of the photographs and the information provided by participant. This person would like to find out how do you go about doing the validation of the photographs and the information uploaded by the participants for the cultivars that the participant has decided to take.
Yes, no, for the moment I would say it's quite primitive. So so we still don't use any advanced technologies and we can still manage it because the amount of information is still manageable. It's not really big data yet. So we basically verify the names and cluster the names based on cultivar groups. So, for example, a red Wairo, a black Wairo, and then independent whether it's how it's written, just the word Wairo. So we cluster it by cultivar groups and taxonomic groups, and then can see how much diversity was observed. And the same, just the photograph just goes as a register. But in the future, I hope that image recognition, uh, especially for tubers, can really play a role to cluster already, and even for the participants to say, this is likely this cultivar group that you're uploading. I think it has a lot of potential, and also for the nomenclature, some simple algorithmics are also able to cluster the names. But for the moment, we are not yet there. No?
Wonderful. Yeah. So we have
Yeah.
three more questions. I hope that's okay with you,
Yeah,
Steph, if we
that's
continue.
fine for me as long
Okay.
as participants are
Yeah,
okay.
we
It's
still have some people here, so we'll continue.
okay.
We have three more questions.
Okay.
This has to do with the indigenous communities, and I'm thinking it has to do with the custodians, right? The families, the custodian families, the guardian families. How long did it take you to convince these farmers and these custodians of the importance of conserving their variety, especially of the importance of documentation? You said you started, I think, back in 2013. How long was there a convincing part of it where you had to convince them about documentation, convince them about, coming together? Is there that inception sort of phase in what you have done with the custodian families, or did they take it up kind of quickly?
Yeah, in the case of the self-organization to uh, to claim benefits and to self-represent the farmers, that came around quite quickly. But the main challenge in the first 5 years was to have the farmers take the lead themselves. No? So in the beginning, And it's, I guess it's for every group. When you put 50 people in a room, they've never met each other before. It just takes time before they, and it took quite a bit of training, have people trained by this Peruvian Society of Environmental Law. The current president, Aura Mendoza, went to the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, had a 1 month training on indigenous rights and intellectual property. But you see in the long term that that really bears its fruit. At the moment, we have about 10 young custodians who have been trained in Ecuador, and so that's an investment in the future. But that takes a few years. With the documentation, I think as soon as people see a catalog, they understand it.
Yeah.
But before they see the catalog, of course, it is all a bit yeah, uh, explaining why we are documenting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. The next one, what is the insight of changes in the conservation strategies for crop with different regeneration systems and industrial interest? So this question has to do with, industrial interest rather than just, in situ conservation. What is the insight of changes in conservation strategies for crops with different regeneration systems or that fall under the industrial category or interest?
Hmm. That's a complex question,
Yeah,
no? Because
right.
also when we talk when does something become industrial? I guess industrial may be large scale farming or like agribusiness. Uh, and in the end, the agribusiness is also dependent on these genetic resources. So I think many companies understand that, even though they don't have a need to access necessarily those genetic resources, which is the case for the potato industry, if you want to call it an industry. But like the 2 largest companies that are supporting Aguapan, they do it without an interest to access. It's more of because they are aware of the importance of biodiversity. Then, so that's the one link. I think that industry recognizes that also they in the end depend on biodiversity if they want to sustain a business model 100 years or 200 years from now. And then, of course, how the industrial agriculture influences landrace populations. That's the maybe the other side of the coin. And I think there our understanding has become much more fine-grained. Like if you go back to the old literature, also the literature that I showed from the 1970s from Hawkes and Ochoa, and that goes all the way to the early 90s, like the main threat for landrace conservation is considered breeding. And I think by now we know that farmers grow modern varieties and landraces at the same time. They are used for different purposes, whether it's market or for food consumptions. They do not always or necessarily replace each other one on one. So I think, of course, we should keep monitoring, but I think the replacement theory of breeding products directly replacing land races is not, it's not so black and white as maybe we used to think in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And our last question, because we're a little bit
Way over
long, but this is a
time.
fantastic question. You have
Yeah.
described one crop in one country. How can we scale this up? And where would we scale it, for example? Would we do fonio in West Africa? What kinds of crops, or how would you scale this up from potato in Peru if you had to do that?
Okay, well that would be my dream. If anyone wants to support this, I think that is what is needed.
Right,
I think the most natural way to scale up is to have a network of the gene banks and replicate it for the mandate crop that they are working on.
Right.
So CIMIT and the National Gene Bank in Mexico for maize, in West Africa, maybe the National Gene Bank for fonio. But to have this network of networks that work on different crops, and where we can also learn whether something is vegetatively propagated, sexually propagated, whether something is a vegetable or a fruit, how it can work for different cases, no? And so I think the principle of monitoring the conservation status is the same for all crops. But I think just like botanical gardens and zoos, if you look at the zoo community, some zoos, for example, Frankfurt Zoo or the zoo in that's close to Wageningen, it's in Rhene, they identify with certain species. So they don't work on the monitoring necessarily of all species, but some of them take one of the key species for which that zoo is known. And with the botanical gardens, I think the same. They have Missouri Botanical Gardens, for example, has a post out in Peru in one particular park. So if we would replicate that model from the zoos and from the botanical gardens to kind of choose our battles, like if you're a CIMIT, you work on the maize land races monitoring. If you're an IITA, you work on the yam population monitoring in West Africa. And so we have these complementary networks that work together between national gene banks, the in-situ civil society community and farmers. I think that's how it could be replicated. And,
Yeah.
and then we need a community of practice, of course. But the whole idea was to, in this case, to provide one deep example for one crop and one country. But indeed, the aspiration is that this will grow to multiple crops and multiple centers of origin.
Wonderful. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. So first of all, thank you, Steph, for preparing this wonderful talk and giving, as you say, an in-depth sight of all the things that have been happening, innovation as well.
Yeah.
Thank you for the participants for attending today. This is wonderful to have your questions, and also to Christelle and Faye in the back for providing the support. Any last words to you before we go, Steph?
No, thank you really for the opportunity. It was really interesting. Apologies, I went over in time, and we have a small community of practice at the moment between 4 Andean countries and about 8 institutions. If anyone is interested to be part, I think we can change it to a wider community of practice about systematic integrated conservation, and feel free to reach out. And again, thank you for being patient. Yeah.
It was wonderful. Thank you very much. We tend to go over, so no problems. Goodbye,
Okay.
everybody. Until the next grow. Take care. Bye-bye,
Yeah.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Okay.